All right, well, I just want to thank everyone for joining us on this Thursday night. This is the November formation for youth ministers on professionalism and goal setting. And we are very lucky to have with us Stacy Noam. And I will let Stacy introduce herself and we'll get started.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm grateful for the opportunity. As a full-time formator, it's especially fun to work with folks, currently in the field. My current position is I'm at the University of Notre Dame in the Masters of Divinity program, where I serve as the Director of Human and Spiritual Formation. So I spend a fair amount of time thinking through and talking through these things with folks. But like I say, for those of you who get to do this live right now, it's kind of an extra treat to hear how some of these thoughts land with you. I'm very interested in how you receive them and any conversation you'd like to have. So I'm going to jump in to some of this, and I'll let you know kind of our agenda or progress as we get a little bit further down. So before we begin, perhaps we could start with a prayer this evening, if that's okay. So I'll ask everybody to begin in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Let's take a moment to arrive in this place and this time and to recall we're in the holy presence of God. Eternal God, in whom mercy is endless and the treasury of compassion inexhaustible, look kindly upon us and increase your mercy in us, that in difficult moments we might not despair nor become despondent, but with great confidence submit ourselves to your holy will, which is love and mercy itself. Amen. In the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So as we spend time together talking about ourselves kind of as minister, focusing on professionalism, I want to acknowledge that it's a little tricky actually to talk about professionalism. There are a lot of different definitions or ways that people approach this, especially from the secular side of things. There's like 5 elements to professionalism or 10 characteristics or 6 tips for how to be more professional. But for our purposes, I think what is really most useful and a very, very good focal point is to simply, but importantly, draw the distinction between personal and professional. As you all know, ministry is a helper profession, right? So we're akin to doctors, social service, counseling, global health folks, etc. And in helper professions, we focus on care of people and on relationships. And then it's all the more natural and easy for the distinction between the personal and the professional to get blurry because of that. I think that's a particular challenge likely for folks in youth ministry. Often youth ministers, you guys get to work in what seem to be easygoing or casual settings for ministry. And so that movement into kind of a more natural kind of space for the personal and professional to overlap is just more possible. So the context of youth ministry is rarely strictly that professional environment of like an office or a church sanctuary, things like that. You kind of flow in and out of more types of spaces more frequently. In ministry, I think an even greater pitfall that we encounter is to think that there's a dichotomy, not just between personal and professional, but the real danger is between thinking there's a dichotomy between pastoral and professional. But the reality is pastoral is professional, right? For us, it is. In fact, pastoris is the root of pastoral, and it's how we get to the language of shepherding. And the shepherding role in our church is always about governance and authority. And in authority, we have to be good stewards of our power, right? So any kind of perceived dichotomy between pastoral and professional just simply isn't accurate. And we run the risk of kind of stepping into dangerous areas when we don't treat it as the same as professional. So all of us still operate in positions of authority, especially you all, over the youth entrusted to your care, and also potentially over volunteers or even supervising other staff or interns. So we both have authority and we share power with our colleagues and supervisors and pastors, et cetera. So because power is involved, mistakes and missteps happen when we treat our work as less than professional. So the way I think we can dive into professionalism tonight for youth ministry is threefold. We're going to talk about boundaries, relationships with colleagues, and goal setting, like Emily said at the top. So my intention is to speak a little bit on each of these and then pause, offer you some personal reflection questions to do in place. And then if you like to have any discussion or anything like that, we'll do that as well. This would be also where I give the invitation to please interrupt with any questions or anything you might have at any time. There's no need to kind of wait to ask questions. If something you'd like more clarification on something I've said, or if I could be more precise in anything that would be useful to you, just say the word. Or if you like, I mean, literally, please don't hesitate to speak up, but you can also use the chat space as well, if that's more comfortable for you, to just put something in the chat if you want me to clarify or do anything there. Does that sound okay? Good. Okay. So let's start with boundaries. Okay. Boundaries set limits, right? They separate me from you, my space from your space, my stuff from your stuff. They separate, but they are not intended to alienate, right? So positively speaking, boundaries are the way we set limits that create a hospitable space where others can come and feel safe with someone who makes room for them and who accepts them. Boundaries are also learned. We might be naturally good or bad at them based on our upbringing or our life's experience, but they are learned and can be cultivated. And there's kind of two big categories of boundaries that I think it's worth spending time on. First, internal boundaries, and then external boundaries. Internal boundaries are about our relationship with ourselves. So this would be things along the lines of like habits of wellness or longevity, caring for yourself, etc. Strong, healthy, emotional internal boundaries help us avoid assuming responsibility for or obsessing over others' feelings or problems. And allow us also to have confident self-expression at the same time. Let us basically drive seat of our own lives, right? So they're the way that we create and maintain a safe space for those we serve. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these in the goal setting space as well. An important thing to remember about boundaries is that, and this gets to the personal and professional relationships, in friendship, boundaries are flexible. In ministry, they need to be more clearly defined and maintained. So attending to the difference between our friendships and our professional or pastoral relationships is a really important thing that we invest time and energy in. Some common external boundaries we might attend to are boundaries around time, space, or person. I'm sure these are super familiar for you who may have gone through, different kind of safe environment trainings and things like that. So just glancingly, boundaries around time, making sure meetings start or stop on time, that you have enough time for a project or aren't taking on too much, right? There's a great danger to over-committing but under-delivering. That's about a time boundary. And then it's always important to attend to differences in multicultural understandings of time, right? I work in a primarily Anglo academic environment, and so it's important that I start and end my classes on time, for example. However, when I go to the Latino parish in town, our pastoral meetings starting on time means something very different, or giving them the time that is their due is a very different reality. So I just want to acknowledge that these boundaries can be very kind of enculturated as well. And it's important that we attend to that. So another of the external boundaries is space. So where ministry occurs, whether it's an office or a coffee shop, kind of a parish space. Now there's virtual spaces that we're attending to. So we're in this mindset of needing to attend to what's called for when we choose the spaces we're in, as you know, right? Do we need confidentiality, or do we need to be in a public space? Do we need to have others around? Do we need to be able to speak carefully? You know, those kinds of things. So space. And then lastly, boundaries around person. And this, again, the safe environment items of like physical boundaries around touch, standing too close, meeting one-on-one with no one else around, etc. And then emotional boundaries, things around like giving gifts that might be too personal, the way we communicate, whether it's texting, phone calls, emails, those types of situations. The main takeaway I want to share on boundaries is that when we're in the position of the pastoral role, the greater burden of moral responsibility falls on the one with the greater power to maintain boundaries. So if we're in a situation where we're in charge of what's going on, or we have more power than the folks who are working for us or what have you, it's our responsibility to put those boundaries in place and to maintain them. I'm going to pause for just a moment in case anyone would like to add anything, any thoughts that you have on the boundary front, or if you have any questions or clarifications or want to push back on anything. It's all very welcome discussion. So I'll pause here. Have you all kind of had, do you encounter this as kind of a restatement of things that you've already been exposed to in other contexts? Is this very familiar to you? Some are nodding. Feel free to use their little reaction emojis too if you want to do that. That's always fine. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put a set of questions for your own personal reflection in the chat space. Let me know if you have any challenges accessing those. Okay, they should be live now. So the questions that I'm just going to give you space to reflect on your own are, first, what are your most significant boundary successes? So where have you found yourself really able to maintain and hold boundaries well? What are some challenges? What are the spaces that are more difficult to do that? Next, what elements in your life contribute to maintaining stronger, clearer boundaries? How do you find that kind of wherewithal or strength or conviction, you know, to hold boundaries? And then how do competing or professional and personal demands, how do competing personal and professional demands impact your boundaries? So I'm going to give each of you probably a good, I want you to be able to reflect. Let's go with about 5 minutes to just reflect in place, and I'll time that so you can think through those on your own. Okay, let's bring it back together, please. And just take a moment to hear, how is that reflection for you? Is this something that you kind of have spent time thinking about previously? How easy is it to kind of think through these elements?
I think I find the one between personal and professional to be the hardest for me. Mm-hmm. I think working from home too during this time complicates that even more. I find myself, you know, there's no, like, I'm working now, I'm at home with my family now. They all kind of blend together, which gets a little bit difficult because you kind of have to put on different hats and, you know, so maybe sometimes I feel like I'm not as professional as I should be because I'm speaking as someone's friend as opposed to coworker or whatever, you know, it gets a little muddled.
That's really helpful, Bridget, to notice that because of the realities of kind of spacing, COVID, those kinds of things, that one of the primary boundaries that's challenging about personal and professional is space. Like often we might think about them stereotypically as relationships that we need to navigate carefully, but when the space is just compressed onto one another, it's really hard to get your mind in one mindset versus another mindset because you're just doing it all from the same sort of space physically.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. What other thoughts did folks have, or what else did you notice as you were reflecting? That's it for now. Okay. Again, if you have any thoughts, please do jump in as you see fit, or if you need me to do anything more with anything I describe. We're going to move into relationships with colleagues then a little bit. And just by way of opening, as we've named already, the environment of youth ministry can at times appear more casual or unique in that way than some other ministerial contexts. And this can impact the way that colleagues and coworkers perceive us, right? Specifically, they might perhaps treat us as less than professional or at least on par with themselves or something like that, which of course is unfair, but comes from a particular place. So in talking about relationships with colleagues, I just want to start out by naming that by virtue of holding a formal position in ministry as you do, you have a certain amount of formal authority, right? And I'm using the word authority here. I'm defining it as the legitimate right to use power. So within your job, you have specific rights to use power that have been vested with you. By power, in this case, I mean the ability to influence kind of outcomes, right, or events. So you have the legitimate right to influence outcomes in particular ways, especially around youth ministry. However, as we all know, just having a job doesn't mean that our coworkers or those we serve vest us with kind of complete confidence or trust. And there are ways that we can win their trust and confidence, i.e. a bit more authority, or we can erode that trust and confidence with other things that we do or say. I think eroding authority happens in a number of ways, certainly, many pertaining to the boundaries that we just named earlier. But winning authority or gathering kind of winning folks' trust and confidence, there's some really specific ways that a particular Jesuit named Brian McDermott talks about this. So he talks about 4 very specific ways to win authority, if you will, or win trust. And I'm realizing for visual learners, I'm going to put something else in the chat just so you can see it as I say it. Okay, so the 4 ways that he talks about being able to win trust and confidence of others is first competence, right? Then lively faith, rootedness in the tradition, and creative fidelity. So competence, straightforwardly, doing your job well, knowing the breadth of the field, performing with excellence, knowing how to communicate and do these things with others. Lively faith, I think we've all had the experience of when we're rooted in our relationship with Jesus and invest time and space in that relationship through prayer regularly, it shows. Not necessarily explicitly in the things we say, but it's evident to those around us that we're serving from a place of our own lively faith. Next, rootedness in the tradition. We understand how the Catholic Church works, maybe specifically the kind of like history of your own institution, parish, etc. Maybe the history of your own youth ministry and kind of what's gone on there. But very broadly speaking, the tradition of the Catholic Church with a capital T. And finally, if we're rooted in the tradition and we have lively faith, we have room for some creative fidelity. So the idea that especially, for example, in times like this, a non-routine time in ministry because of the pandemic, we have room to think with abundance about the ways that we can serve folks while still being very rooted in tradition and faithful to the way that we can do things as Catholics. So competence, lively faith, rootedness in the tradition, and creative fidelity. These are ways that we can kind of win folks' trust and confidence in us. Most often we demonstrate these elements through our demeanor, but also through verbal and nonverbal communication. So another element of professionalism that I'd like to discuss slightly is articulating ourselves well. There's probably a lot of ways that we could have extended conversation about communication and things like that, but I want to kind of do a step back and say that to articulate ourselves well, there are two halves to that: knowing yourself and knowing the people you're communicating with, right? So knowing yourself, what is my own style of getting my thoughts together and to communicate or articulate things that are important? And then knowing your people, especially your supervisor, but also colleagues, those you're serving, etc. Both of these, knowing yourself and knowing your people, have some very specific categories for consideration. Namely, first, knowing the needs at hand. So what are my needs that I need to be aware of? But also, what are the needs of my supervisor? What are they hoping for or looking for? Another way of talking about knowing needs would be, you could say that like, what are the parish's objectives and what are the objectives for youth ministry, right? So my perception of those and my supervisor's or pastor's perception of those. The next one, as far as categories for consideration, are strengths and weaknesses. So what are my particular strengths? What are my weaknesses? And similarly with my boss or colleagues or what have you, what are their long suits, their strengths, and what are their blind spots or weaknesses? How can we be complementary to each other? How can I comprehend how to help them understand something that they might not otherwise go out of their way to understand or see from my perspective? So first needs, then strengths and weaknesses, and finally personal work style. So this goes, along with knowing like introversion and extroversion, internal processing, external processing, but also preferred methods of communication. Especially again with a supervisor, do they prefer in-person communication? Do they prefer email? Do they prefer a Zoom conversation that's as in person as you can get sometimes? Or texting? Do they like formal communication or informal communication? And do they prefer different things for different levels of information that needs to get shared or processed? So all of these things are important to think through when we talk about knowing ourselves so that we know how to articulate ourselves well, but also knowing the folks that we're communicating with so that we can communicate into the space that they can receive best, right? So again, that's knowing the needs, strengths and weaknesses, and personal work style. The last thing I would say about working with colleagues and specifically articulating ourselves well is it's important to be your own best advocate. And what I mean by this is no one can read minds, right? So each of us needs to be able to name what we need, right? Or explain our perspective, or offer our opinion, or advocate for the youth we serve. If we do not, there's no way to be sure others will understand our perspective, let alone take it into account. So it's our responsibility to be our own best advocate, or be our youth ministry's own best advocate, by making our voice heard, making our voice known in the most hearable way, maybe would be a better way of saying that. So I'm just going to pause for a moment, just recapping. So we talked a bit about authority, that there are ways to win authority, that it's important to be able to articulate ourselves well. And that's about knowing ourselves and others and their styles and preferred styles and kind of foci, their objectives. And then making sure that we advocate for ourselves when we need to. So again, I'm going to pause. Does anyone have anything that they'd like to check in about, comment on, or ask for clarification on in any way? Does this connect with anything that you've been thinking about yourselves or anything like that? And again, feel free to jump in or use the chat, whatever's easier for you.
I just want to say something, Stacy. So when you talk about creative fidelity, I think that right now is a time that people are having to be creative anyway in their ministry.
Yep.
And this could be a really great opportunity to really dive into your own creative fidelity in what your ministry will look like moving forward, even after the pandemic. Mm-hmm. I think that because of necessity, your pastor and your teammates may be looking to you to come up with these creative ways that you could transition your traditional ministry into for the future as well.
I completely agree. That's a really helpful point, Emily. Thank you. Another element that comes up actually with the same theologian McDermott, he talks about non-routine times. So routine authority during routine times and non-routine times. And during non-routine times, he speaks, of course, specifically about like the need for safety and boundaries, yes, but also orientation, that it's our responsibility as kind of pastoral ministers to be able to give folks direction, to be able to point out the course and say, this is where we can go right now and how we're going to get there. We talk about the purpose and how we get to that place, the energy that needs to go with that. And that's very particular to kind of like a non-routine space like you're talking about. There's a lot of opportunity during non-routine times, even though it doesn't so much always feel like a lot of opportunity. It just feels tiring sometimes, I think. Okay. Jump in if you need to. I'm going to go ahead and give you another set of reflection questions for yourselves. I want to leave a little space. Try that. Okay. Good. Okay. So the questions for reflection now are, first, just taking stock for yourself. How are your relationships with your colleagues, your peers, your supervisor, your pastor, etc.? So just take a moment to think through, how are those things? Next, how would you evaluate the confidence others have in you? Are there spaces you've won authority? How did you do that? Are there spaces where you may have potentially eroded authority? We all have missteps. How did that go? What were some of the root causes behind that? And then if you take a minute to evaluate your supervisor along the lines of the elements that we named. So what are their needs? What do they perceive as the most important objectives? What would you notice are their strengths or blind spots? And what is their preferred work style, especially the style of communication they most prefer from you? And again, I'll just be quiet here, let you have space for about 5 minutes. Okay, shall we come back together? I'll pause just again. No need to, share in detail if that's uncomfortable at all, but any kind of reactions or thoughts in reaction to kind of this category of thought around communication with those you're working with, colleague relationships and so on, relationships with your supervisor, etc.
Hey, Stacy. One of the things that I think is unique to youth ministry is we go through a lot of turnover with our
Yeah.
pastors. It's like if you have a really vibrant, amazing pastor who's very ministry oriented, and then I'm going to say 6 years, maybe less nowadays, but every 6 years we get a turnover.
Yeah.
And then you find someone who's totally not on board. They rather keep the distance.
Yeah.
And so you go through these ebbs and flux where they could be a very good pastor, but their belief in keeping the youth distant is more important than it is to incorporate our young people into the parish life.
Yeah.
So I find that to be for youth ministry.
Yeah.
It's very difficult.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like there are real ebbs and flows as far as, and this is true, right? Like it totally depends on your pastor, it totally depends on your bishop, etc. Kind of how these things go, but especially with a pastor, like you say, if that turnover is happening 6 years or less,
yes.
How does one weather that, do you think?
Well, youth ministry is kind of like a life preserver. You do have to stay afloat and you have to keep your head above the water.
Mm-hmm.
But it does become difficult, and one of the things that I've experienced is around me is a lot of youth ministry burnout.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you're like being pulled along. It's like a lazy river.
Mm-hmm.
You're just floating along.
Yeah.
In a big old tube of yay youth ministry.
That's a good image.
And then Yeah, and then other times you're like inundated with like, we can't swim, and
Hmm.
so the burnout, I find that the burnout is really huge, and especially in our vicariate right now, youth ministry is at a premium. We don't have that many active youth ministers
Oh,
or active youth ministries, and so, like I say, we have to be the life preserver that just stays. You can throw us, and we
yeah.
have to float.
Yeah, I hear you. I I'm really glad you're naming this actually, Rosie. Thank you, especially also for naming the like relationship to burnout and what that does. Um Certainly not an ideal situation. I think part of I'd like to connect it a little to what we're going to do with the goal setting piece, because I think it gets a little bit into, so if my pastor or the kind of administration of the parish is not on board and this like force for pushing us along and full energy along with us, where are we going to find the wherewithal within ourselves then to be that buoyancy for youth ministry? And I think part of the goal setting things that we talk about might contribute to that. I'm actually curious if one would say, oh, that's helpful or enough, if you will. So let's turn to that now. So I'm going to talk about goal setting broadly speaking, but I mean, how do we talk about this in a year when everything's shifting, right? Some folks may be completely virtual. Some of you may have a couple sessions in person with folks. Emily named appropriately, like, takes a lot of creative fidelity right now. I also think beyond creative fidelity, or in addition to it, I think this is a great opportunity to take a step back and take stock and potentially initiate some adjustments of our own ministerial habits are not vocationally sustainable. So this is to that point of burnout. Like, okay, am I in a position where I need to do more so that I can sustain this vocation that I feel I've been given or that I've responded to? One way to take stock is to think about your kind of like telos or ultimate aim, right? Like, what is the overarching goal of your youth ministry from your perspective? Right? So, like in the previous section, what is your objective? How would you name the vision for what youth ministry is in your context? Another, so that's outside, that's the ministry itself. Another more internal is your own mission. How do you comprehend, or would you articulate your own mission statement? You could say, but what I want to point towards is that I think when we have a clarity of mission for ourselves, it usually has two parts. One is identity, like I understand myself to be, and the other then, which pours out of that identity, is purpose, or like the call that I've received, right? So all of us might say, as a baptized Christian, I am called to love God and to bring God's love to other people. We're all called to that, the universal call to holiness, right? But you could get more specific in a lot of ways, right? Like, I understand myself to be a beloved daughter of God. And as such, I listen for God's call and will in my life and try to follow that will. These are very broad, but you could get particularly specific too, given time to focus on these things. And I'm going to give you all, in your reflection time, I'm going to give you a little space to kind of reflect on how would I articulate, if I were just kind of spitballing, just a draft in this moment. That's not a lot of time to reflect, but if I were to articulate kind of a mission for myself, what would that look like? So we'll do that in just a moment. So one way to step back and take stock are those things, like overarching vision for youth ministry, my mission as I understand it. Another is to acknowledge that you are your best ministerial resource, you. So we need to make sure that you steward your energy and your well-being carefully. To that end, I'm going to talk just a little bit through what I would call habits of wellness and habits of longevity. Habits of wellness, and I sure don't think we're reinventing the wheel here. I'm just naming things that you're probably very familiar with. But for the sake of sharing them in common, I'll name them, but I'm also going to put them visually for you. Okay, so in the chat, they're there. So the 5 habits of wellness that we form our MDiv students into, at Notre Dame at least, are prayer, sleep, nutrition, physical activity, and restorative niche activities, so restorative activities. Prayer, very straightforward. Sociologically, it's been proven that even for non-Christians, up to 5 minutes of some meditative exercise a day can be very helpful for your overall well-being. Well, in Christian context, we would name that prayer, right? So it's essential that I spend time in prayer each day for my well-being as well as my ministerial longevity. And of course, we would probably really love to have more than 5 minutes. That would just be kind of a minimum that folks have pointed to physiologically. Sleep here, it's not so much, make sure you go to bed on time, as much as, do you know how much rest you need to feel well rested and ready for the day ahead? And do you usually get that amount that you need to feel well rested? And if you don't, why don't you? Do you have control over if you do or don't? I mean, parents of newborn babies probably don't have that control over it. And there might be a lot of reasons that you might not either. But if you do have control over that and you're not getting enough, why is that? So kind of self-evaluating. Nutrition, this is not about diet. This is about, or dieting, I should say. This is about attending to, do I put what I need to be nourished in my body? Sometimes this is attending to hydrating enough. Sometimes this is, for me, it's making sure I eat enough green things in a day. It's very hard. But we all know, right? Like we all know our particular nutritional challenges. Do we try to attend to them most of the time? Physical activity, not necessarily about exercise, more about acknowledging that ministry by its very nature is very emotional, it's very cerebral and intellectual. And so we need to use our physical bodies as well, right? Like we need to be able to release stress in that way, but we also need the balance of kind of that intellectual balanced with physical. And then finally, restorative activities. There are all kinds of restorative activities. 3 primary ones are, as we named, rest, sleep, right? Also what we call detaching and relaxing. That's one thing. Detaching and relaxing is being in a state where you are not thinking about work at all. So nothing, it's not coming into your mind. You're not thinking about colleagues or the people you serve or anything like that. You're just completely detached. This could be things like enjoying a movie, walking in conversation, glass of wine with someone, that kind of thing. Detach and relax. And it's suggested that for kind of the best benefits, that we need to detach and relax at least 4 times a week. And then finally, restorative niche type activities. These are more along the lines of hobbies, right? Like, so things that we just enjoy doing for their own sake, often things where you can get better and better at them, right? Like, so all kinds of sport activities might be like this. Crafting activities might be like this. There's so many. Building little ships and bottles could be like this. If you're a connoisseur of something, whether it's wine or beer or coffee, kind of like indulging in those things would be like this. So these 5 habits of wellness are things that are really essential to things to attend to are, and very briefly, not nearly as long as of kind of ministerial longevity. So super simply, it's annual retreats or days of reflection and days of recollection. So it's lovely when you can get away for a retreat. Some of our seminarians, always prioritize a 1-week retreat. As a layperson, that's certainly not as viable necessarily, especially with children and things like that. But if you can do a retreat, that's wonderful. I focus on trying to get in days of reflection intermittently throughout the year. So we're on a semester system. I try to do 1 day of reflection each semester. So just a day away, a day of retreat or prayer time myself. Now, the reason I say day of reflection and then alternatively I say day of recollection is because days of recollection aren't about me as much as those I minister to. So these are days where I step away. It's not in the midst of work, but I only pray and think and talk with God about my ministry and those entrusted to my care. So for me, it's a day where I kind of page through my students. I pray for my students and think about what God might be calling me to do to serve them better. So that's the distinction I'm trying to suggest around days of reflection for ourselves and our own spiritual life, days of recollection for the sake of our ministry. Finally, one other very important thing to attend to, or category to attend to for our well-being, are essential relationships. And again, I love to rely on the work of Matt Bloom, a sociologist who's worked in thriving in ministry. And he talks about the 3 essential relationships of mentor, peer in ministry, and true friend. So he says that what he's found from all of his research is that these are the relationships that a minister needs to have to help them avoid burnout. So a mentor, very straightforwardly, it's someone who is a little bit further along the journey than we are in ministry and who is invested in us personally. So it's not the same as a role model, right? Someone we might aspire to or like to emulate, but someone who's also equally invested in us personally. So takes an interest in conversation and kind of helping us along. A peer in ministry is someone who does the same sort of work you do, but not in the same place you do it. So they don't have a stake, for example, in your parish. So all of y'all on this phone call could, or on this Zoom call, could be peers in ministry to each other if you're at, for example, different parishes. And what is that about? Well, a peer in ministry is someone who, if you're just frustrated and such just happened, and you call someone up and you're like, I totally need to process this with someone, you all know the shorthand with each other. You know the implications of, we were supposed to do this, but it got cut because of this, and these students, and this thing, and my pastor. Like, there's no reason to explain why those things matter. You just understand because it's another youth minister. So that's a peer in ministry. And then finally, a true friend. True friends, just as they sound. A true friend is someone who you can be your offstage self with, doesn't necessarily have to do with work, just able to kind of, put the facades aside, and they love you for who you are. A little trick to the true friend is that research suggests that they need to be geographically proximate to you. You need to be physically able to spend time with them. Super tricky in COVID. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. We've talked through kind of goal setting first about, like, if we're thinking in the ministerial context of what's the overarching vision for youth ministry where you are, what would you name as your own mission or focus? And then as your own best ministerial resource, how do you take care of yourself with habits of wellness, longevity, and those essential relationships? I'm going to pause before we go into any kind of reflection. I'm going to pause in case anybody would like to name anything that they might find missing. I mean, you've been doing this for a while. You probably know some really good ways to take care of yourselves. When I name these things, are you noticing anything that I omitted or that we haven't named here for everyone? I'd be really interested in that. No, not necessarily. Okay, I'm gonna put another set of reflection questions in, but I wanna add a question I was just thinking. Sorry about this. Okay, and now I'm editing for typographical errors. Okay, good. And I'll put this in the chat. Not there yet, sorry. Okay. Okay, it should be there for everyone. So the first one, we're going to pause for self-evaluation. So in these habits of wellness, which are just above it there in the chat, just self-evaluate in those areas. How are you doing? Can you name what you need in each of those spaces, and how are you doing with that? Next, do you have time for some of the habits of longevity? Do you try to make space for some type of reflection or retreat, some type of recollection? Do you have someone in each of the essential relationship roles? I'll retype those in the chat in case anyone needs that. Can you name what the overarching kind of vision or goal for you in your context is for youth ministry? And then if you want to play with it, you could try to compose a draft mission statement using the formula, because I am, feeling like identity statement. I understand myself to be called to, and this would be kind of like that vocational kind of statement. just if you're interested in kind of playing with that. So again, I'll give you a good 5 minutes or more just to get started thinking on these things. And I'll go ahead and type in those essential relationships in case you need them there too. Good? Okay. Okay. Thank you all for that reflection. This is the end of my prepared remarks and reflections. I'd like to stop now to discuss any thoughts or reactions, clarifications you might like. So anything that would be useful for you all.
Stacy,
Mm-hmm.
and this is also for Emily. Going over the notes that I've taken tonight and stuff, this also seems like maybe it fringes on something maybe the CREs and DREs would really benefit from.
Oh, yeah.
I know that we focused it on youth ministry, but youth in general, and in in um, in religious education, there's more hierarchy as opposed to youth ministry, and so this, at least for me, Emily, it seems that it would overlap, and it would not do them any harm to. I'm just saying.
No, I mean, we want to first do no harm, right? That's why I'm laughing.
Let's do no harm. You know,
no
they would benefit from this the way you presented it, the way you put it, because sometimes catechists feel very much alone, and so, you know, these last 3 steps, you know, a peer, a mentor, a peer, this is something that is very structured and I think would benefit.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, Rosie. And like you said, this is really prevalent to anyone in ministry, not even just those who work with youth. And so one of the benefits of having these recorded sessions is we can share those out. And so I know that the plan is to tidy it up a little bit. We have someone in who is better with computers and technology than I am that will kind of edit it seamlessly. But I think that's a great point, that sharing it with our colleagues in the religious education side will also be really helpful.
It went a lot more quickly tonight than this morning. So, you know, use this video.
Okay, you guys will be on camera. No, and I think that even for working with others in your own parish, if they have these same thought processes about them and their own ministry, then it'll create better dialogue between you. So.
Oh yes. Yep.
Yeah, it's great suggestion.
It's like a shared vocabulary, right? It's super useful to be able to speak with one another this way, I think. I'm really glad you
professionalism, I also believe that it might be, you know, something that can be brought in and would help move dialogue forward. Because if you don't have it, as you say, a shared vocabulary, and this is something that is very helpful in presenting, oh, this is how we're supposed to interact with each other, and or how we should interact with each other, and what is good for our own good benefit.
Yeah. Yeah, that actually you're reminding me, and just for everyone's benefit on this in this Zoom session, this morning or midday, someone used the example of how challenging. So in the boundaries context, like how to keep space and time, communication boundaries, what happens when your colleagues, you name boundaries you have, but your colleagues don't respect them, in the sense that like they'll do things themselves in another way, so you get left, or your initiatives get left kind of out then. Like what does one do to bridge them in that case, where you're holding healthy boundaries and they're not? The workplace is less healthy, you know, what do you do? So yes, vocabulary helps there too. I think you're right. What other thoughts or connections did y'all have?
Hi, can you hear me? This is John Poen from Holy Cross. Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
We can hear you, John. Thank you.
for me, what's particularly nice is these questions I find I don't think through unless they're posed to me.
Oh yeah.
So a lot of this would seem obvious, right? And you'd say, oh yeah, these are things we talk about or think about, and in fact, none of it is until it's posed in a session like this. So for me, just some of the points you made in the chat, just the essentials, taking care of yourself, making time to reflect. How's your relationship with your pastor, and how does that affect the ministry? Those kinds of things I can look back on and give a little thought to, because it's just something that I don't usually. You're dealing with especially today, you're dealing with one emergency after another.
Yeah.
Someone just tested positive. How are you going to have the peer ministry meeting you've scheduled? And so on.
Yeah.
So anyway, thank you.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we're all in that boat with ministry. I completely resonate with what you're saying. I would not reflect on, I think we all assent to these things, right? But I'm not going to carve out the space to reflect on them unless someone tells me I have to.
Right, exactly. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, Stacy, for me on my end, the day of recollection has really resonated on me. Sometimes we're moving so fast and we forgot to kind of just sit down or pause, and we're putting all the pieces together and see where's the big picture is at. And, even myself, and those questions that we're looking at today, I can always reflect on them, and have my own little retreat or recollection day.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. So thank you for that.
You are welcome, for sure. The recollection piece, I was always trying to figure out, like, how is it that I never seem to pray about my ministry? I'm being told I should take a retreat, but should it be about me or should it be about other people? And that's not the same thing. So dividing them has been very freeing, I find. So thanks. I agree with that. I really am grateful for that space when I have it.
I actually have one question though. Is there a particular question that you for a recollection that you asked, or how does that, how does that look like?
Well, so I think so I work with a set of students, right? Like there's a roster of students that I have, 50 students that I have, right? And then I have specific programs I'm responsible for. So when I go on a day of retreat, and I'm sure or recollection, and I'm sure y'all have the same kind of savvy when you get to this space. I usually start the day in mass if I can, but in just private prayer, thinking through, Lord, where do you want me to go today? I follow that, but I'm certain that part of the day will be paging through those people. So usually part of my afternoon after lunch, usually outside if at all possible, so I don't fall asleep, is actually walking if I can. And I keep the roster of people with me, and I just read a name and just try to bring them to mind and think through, what do I know about them right now? What's going on with them? Is there anything I need to attend to? Invite the Holy Spirit into that reflection. So it's not terribly complicated or long, and it's just my own process. You may have one that comes right to mind, or that the Holy Spirit will shoot at you when you're praying, but that's mine.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, Emily, do you have anything else you want to make sure that we do or attend to?
All right, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks, Stacy, for putting this on. It was great to have you guys all here this evening. And thanks for your great suggestions that brought up, especially Rosie. I'm going to get it out to those CREs, DREs. All right, have a good night, everybody.
Good night,
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks.